So in this video, we're going to be looking at the key thinkers in conservatism, and very brief recap, 5 key thinkers per ideology. You can mention other key thinkers, but they don't count as key thinkers for the assessment criteria. And it's a 24-mark essay and 2 significant caps on that one. If you don't have a balanced argument, you'll be capped at level 2, which is 9 out of 24. And if you don't mention, reference, include 2 key thinkers, again you're capped at level 2 as well, which is quite a harsh cap. Okay, key thinkers in conservatism. Thomas Hobbes, we've mentioned in liberalism. Edmund Burke, Michael Oakeshott, and Robert Nozick and Ayn Rand, who we also mentioned in neoliberalism as representatives of neoliberalism. And only one sort of significant other thinker I've dropped in, which would be Disraeli. Or again, he's more of a thinker in action. He was more a politician. Thomas Hobbes, again, as we went through in liberalism, was living at the time of the English Civil War. He thought it was like a state of nature, law and order, society had broken down. It wasn't a very nice place to live in. An individual's life was solitary, nasty, brutish and short. So what's a person to do? And even though you had absolute freedom, you had no security. So therefore it was rational for people to give up some of their freedom in return for security and protection. And you can have a brief linkage of Hobbes and liberalism, but really he fits more comfortably in conservatism, and particularly authoritarian conservatism, which the syllabus calls traditional conservatism. So I'm just going to call that traditional conservatism anymore. So Hobbes, as we've seen, was a monarchist. Really, he was arguing for a restoration of pretty much an absolute monarch. It was not 100% absolute, but it was as near as damn it to an absolute monarch, which got him into trouble, and he ended up having to flee to France. So in terms of core conservative ideas that Hobbes contribute to, human imperfection, other than that kind of moment of rationality when we decided we would like to give up some freedom, we are needy, vulnerable and easily led astray. We are imperfect and we seek security. The state is authoritarian and powerful. Hobbes wasn't talking about the state, he was talking about Leviathan, but conservatives then draw on Hobbes to argue for an authoritarian and powerful state. And you can have a Hobbesian view of a state, or you can have a Hobbesian view of international affairs, where strong, powerful states impose international order. And society, well, you can't have society without the strong state, because strong state impose order. So in terms of links to traditional conservative ideas, it's really about authority, human imperfection. We have a duty to obey authority in return for security. It's a very hard type of paternalism, which is what traditional authoritarian conservatives would advocate. People like de Maistre, you do what you're told. And again, some quotes that's easy enough to remember. And at the top of the book, Leviathan, the original one, it had a quote from the Bible, from the book of Job: "There is no power on earth compared to him," and again referring to the ultimate absolute power that Leviathan has. So that was Hobbes' traditional authoritarian conservative. Leads us on to Edmund Burke, who is really kind of a linchpin of not really one nation, old-fashioned, traditional, paternalistic, organic conservatism. Burke was born in Ireland. He moved over to England, briefly thought about the law before turning to politics, and we came across him in paper 1 and his notion of Burkean representation when he wrote that famous letter to the electors when he was MP for Bristol. And the Conservative MP Jesse Norman has a very good book out about Edmund Burke, as well as he does have one about Adam Smith as well. So Jesse Norman, if you want some wider reading. Burke was a member of the Whig Party, and his patron was Lord Rockingham, who was briefly Prime Minister. Sort of as an aside, where I was born in the borders of Leitrim was common in the west of Ireland, and the whole area used to be part of the Rockingham estate, Lord Rockingham. All that's left now is a big national park, which we used to call Rockingham Park, but is now being renamed to the more post-colonial Lough Key Forest Park. And there was a big John Nash house in the park called Rockingham House. which burned down in 57. And if you read any of the official explanations, it says the fire was caused by an electrical fault, but everyone local knew it was the Republicans what did it. Anyway, back to Burke. So before Reflections on the Revolution in France, which is the book Burke is probably best known for, in many ways he was seen as a progressive thinker stroke politician. He was critical of the abuses of the East India Company, and he supported the colonists in the American War of Independence. So for some it was a shock then when he came out in support of the monarchy, the French monarchy, and Reflections on the Revolution in France. And in the Reflections, Burke was arguing against the kind of rationalism that was driving the French revolutionaries, and how they were sweeping away the old ancien regime, the monarchy, the aristocracy, the church, all of those things, and starting with tabula rasa, a clean slate. And Burke argued, famously, society, you couldn't just sweep it away, because society was a partnership between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are to be born. And we had a duty to respect this society that had been handed on to us by our forebears. And each generation had a duty to learn from the experience and to honour the achievement and sacrifices of their forebears and preserve the best of these for future generations. In a similar vein, Chesterton, the poet in the 20th century, he described this kind of respect for the past, for tradition, as giving voice to the most obscure of all classes, our ancestors. A very striking phrase, the democracy of the dead. Again, echoing Burke's assertion that no generation should ever be so rash as to consider itself superior to its predecessors. So tradition was represented, really, that phrase Burke didn't use, but the accumulated wisdom of the past, and we should use tradition as a guide for action and have a respect for the traditions that have grown up, because the institutions that have survived they have been tested by time in this kind of Darwinian sense. And in a way, the rationality of society, although it's kind of an anachronistic term to use with conservative thinkers, the rationality of society over generations in preserving some institutions, values and practices is more reliable than the rationality of any one individual or any one generation at any one time. So Burke brings lots and lots of contributions to conservative thinking, the idea of tradition, the accumulated wisdom of the past, a guide for action, human imperfection, humans are imperfect and we should rely on tradition and respect for authority. Humans are crooked timber, which I think is a sort of Kantian term. The state has emerged organically, and it should be run by a natural aristocracy, people of breeding and experience, a bit like his patron, Lord Rockingham. The economy, yes, he's a supporter of the market, or more being trade at the time. Property is a source of social stability, and markets themselves have emerged organically. If you read Pocock on Burke, Burke advocated trading to help the expansion of what then was called manners. Manners being social interaction between different groups of people in different countries. And a bit like the conservative politician Enoch Powell, who famously said every night he gets on his knees and thanks God for capitalism. And he wasn't really talking about capitalism tooth and claw. What he was arguing was really that capitalism encourages nations to trade and people to interact with one another, and that was very good for the stability of society and stability of the world, and the spread of manners, the spread of civilized behaviour. So Burke is a supporter of what we would call capitalism, although it wasn't, he's predating it slightly, but the supporter of trade and interaction and business as a source of social stability, and the market had emerged organically as well, and society was organic, which we'll come back to in the next person we look at, Disraeli, composed of the little platoons. It's the smallest structure, kind of, and Cameron had a kind of echo of that with his big society as well. And also because you can link them to authority, people have a duty to obey authority. And then some of Burke's quotes, those who are partnership, those who are living, those who are born, etc. Mistake shouldn't make with conservatism is that it doesn't want any change. What it wants is slow, gradual, controlled change. And Burke's criticism of the French monarchy, that it was too rigid, that they should have recognised and been able to introduce some gradual reform to maintain their position. And he says a state without the means of some change is without the means of its conservation. And there's that lovely quote from the Leopard, which was, if we want things to stay the same here, things are going to have to change. Okay, so that's Burke, clearly a key, uppercase key thinker in conservatism. The next person to introduce would be Disraeli. Again, he's not a key thinker in the syllabus, but clearly is the pivot for one nation conservatism, coined after Disraeli himself. And Disraeli was really trying to find a place for the Conservative Party in this new kind of industrial society that had emerged in England and that was moving increasingly towards political democracy. And it couldn't stay stuck with the dealing with only people of privilege and wealth as it had in the past. Where was it going to reinvent itself? So Disraeli championed a program of social reforms, and in doing so he draws on kind of Burkean notion of organic society and even goes back into kind of feudal times, arguing that wealth and privilege brought with them social obligations, particularly towards the poor and those less well off. Again, drawing on this feudal idea of noblesse oblige, the obligations of the nobility. And again, this draws on the conservative notion of the organic society and the interconnectedness of all the parts, and the notion that society, the glue that held society together, is the acceptance of duty and obligations. So this idea of one nation conservatism is different from traditional conservatism. It's more a kind of soft paternalism rather than the hard paternalism of the kind of Hobbesian view of the world. And one nation conservatives today would say, that approach is very principled. There's a genuine moral and ethical concern to assist those who are less well off, and there's an obligation, the price of privilege and the old Spiderman thing, with great power comes great responsibility, to look after those less well off. And quote from Disraeli, the health of the people is really the foundation upon which all their happiness and all the powers of the state depend. So Disraeli brings this kind of idea of one nation conservatism and draws on conservative ideas such as the organic society and the interconnectedness. Now, one nation conservatism can be used as the basis for, limited social and economic intervention. It's not to produce a fair society, it's to maintain social cohesion and look after those who are less well off. It looks similar to modern or social liberalism, but it's more limited and has a different aim. So yes, it can be seen from a principle perspective, but if you're more cynical, you could say that this one nation preference for limited social and economic reform is based on self-serving pragmatism in a negative sense, because pragmatism can have a positive interpretation and a negative interpretation. A positive interpretation, pragmatic, somebody who responds to changing circumstances. You might consider yourself a pragmatic person, but it can also have a negative connotation. You're a pragmatist, you have no fixed principles, you simply will do whatever it takes to maintain whatever position you are in at the moment. And from the negative interpretation of pragmatism, you can say that conservative social and economic reform is nothing to do with looking after those less well off, really. It's to do with to preserve and consolidate society's existing hierarchy. That phrase, the palace isn't safe when the cottage is not happy, suggesting that reform from above is much preferable to revolution from below. So that was Disraeli. And one nation conservatism, if you want to draw it into sort of the 19th century and the 20th century, Irving Kristol, neoconservative in America in the 80s, he said, limited social and economic intervention is perfectly compatible with conservatism. He says the idea of a welfare state is perfectly consistent with conservative political philosophy, so long as it meets the needs and members of the society. And post-1945, when the Conservatives suddenly find, the NHS is quite good and managed economy is quite good, and trying to justify this kind of U-turn they made. Rab Butler, famous for Butskelism and the One Nation Conservative, he claimed that our support for the welfare state and the Keynesian principle of economy based on full employment were little more than an updated expressions of our belief in one nation and paternalism. So again, this thread of one nation paternalistic conservatism runs through most of conservatism for its existence from Disraeli onwards, which leads us on to the next thinker, and that's Michael Oakeshott. And interestingly, Oakeshott probably can be called a conservative thinker, although it's a bit of an oxymoron for conservatism, in that he did write books on conservative philosophy. And Oakeshott really adds to the pragmatic, the anti-ism strand of conservative thought. And conservatives by and large are against isms, any isms, rationalism, socialism, liberalism, because they draw on, I suppose they're not against pragmatism, they draw on pragmatism, they're against abstract ideas. So in the essay he's probably most famous for, in Rationalism and Politics in 1962, Oakeshott attacks the kind of assumptions that underpin these isms, and particularly the misplaced faith in rationalism, which kind of takes us back to the very first video in this sequence where we looked at the Enlightenment. And he really attacks this idea of enlightenment or rational thinking. And he said humans are imperfect and we can't know everything, and we shouldn't try and base our actions on kind of rational or abstract ideas. Again, Oakeshott kind of echoes Burke, and he says from a rationalist or enlightenment perspective, politics consists of designing institutions according to abstract principles without any regard for cultural and tradition, not taking into account the democracy of the dead, or the contract between those who are living and those who are dead. And so by rejecting everything except reason, Oakeshott argued that rationalism loses sight of practical knowledge that is embedded in these human practices. This rationality that institutions existed and survived for particular reasons of our forefathers or forebears or ancestors, whatever you want to call them, and we shouldn't ignore that, this accumulated wisdom of the past and the democracy of the dead. And in his attack on rationalism, Oakeshott uses a lovely analogy. He says that society is like a ship which sails in a bottomless and boundless sea. And for believers in isms, they're always trying and failing to chart a course towards a rational destination based on their beliefs. So like a socialist captain will be trying to sail the ship towards a socialist shore, and a liberal captain towards a liberal shore, and they never really succeed, and they do more harm than good. Whereas conservative captain is not worried about where they're going. The main task is to keep the ship afloat. There's no real destination. Keep the ship afloat, keep the crew content, and address problems as they arise. So Oakeshott, again, very much in the kind of one nation, traditional conservative, human imperfection. He's not as pessimistic as Hobbes about people, but we are imperfect and we are unpredictable. Tradition, very much a successor to the Burkean ideas, limited reform only when necessary. The state has emerged organically, again should be guided by pragmatism, and again he would support private property the same way as Burke would as well. And very pragmatic, linked to human imperfection, and again using the analogy and metaphor of keeping the ship afloat, and authority. Imperfect humans find comfort in the known and the familiar, and also this rejection of abstract ideas. And lots of quotable things. A politician of conservative disposition will find small and slow changes more tolerable than large and sudden, and he will value every appearance of continuity. And you can see the echoes of Burke in that as well. And the danger of radical form, the manner that be careful of what you do, the cure is not worse than the disease. And then his sort of sailing metaphor: in political activity, men sail a boundless and bottomless sea. There is neither harbour, nor shelter, nor floor for anchorage, neither starting place nor appointed destination. The enterprise is to keep afloat on an even keel. to keep society cohesive and stable and orderly. Next key thinker then, Nozick, who again we've come across in liberalism, and we saw that in the 70s there was this resurgence of classical liberal thought called New Liberalism, and Nozick was an academic colleague of Rawls in Harvard, and Rawls wrote his theory of justice from a kind of liberal left of centre point of view, and Nozick's most famous book for us in this context was his answer to Rawls from a right-wing libertarian point of view, Anarchy, the State and Utopia. And at the core of Nozick's argument was this idea of individual sovereignty. We are the owners, we hold absolute sovereignty over our person, our talents, our skills, and we are entitled to use those skills and benefit from them as we see fit. And Nozick says that's natural justice. Whatever outcome results from us using our talents, the free exchange of labour, is a just one. So instead of Rawls's idea of social justice, he says natural justice. In contrast to this, he says if any state tries to impose egalitarian measures to make society more equal, that is wrong because it's an infringement on your property rights, but it also simply leads outcomes that favour groups that are electorally significant, the elderly, insider pressure groups, powerful producer groups. And that's the kind of echo of the airy liberal fear of democracy, that expansion of democracy would lead to an infringement on property rights. So Nozick favours the absolute minimal state, only concerned with the enforcement of contracts and security, and hence the description of him as a minarchist. He's only a cigarette paper between him and an anarchist who would advocate no state at all. So this is where conservatism takes a sharp swing. So where all the previous ones we looked at agreed on human imperfection, but now the last two thinkers, Nozick and Rand, they believe in human perfection. They are classical liberals. We are rational, self-interested actors, and we can't be treated as a thing or used against our will as a resource, again, a kind of Kantian thing. The state should be absolute minimal state, and the economy, the best way to ensure this kind of natural justice is a free market economy, exchange based on a free market, a free exchange. Freedom, he's really a libertarian, minarchist, stressing almost absolute freedom for individuals over their own bodies, talents, etc., and absolute minimal state. So you can see where you come up in tensions within conservatism, particularly between the new right, which was this marriage of traditional authoritarian conservatism and this neoliberal conservatism. But again, you can throw them into liberal essays as well. And you can easy enough quotes to remember: no state more extensive than the minimal state can be justified. A distribution of justice arises from another just distribution by legitimate means is natural justice. And probably the most famous phrase he's linked with is taxation is legalised theft, although that's not exactly what he says. He says taxation of earnings from labour is on a par with forced labour. Seizing the results of someone's labour is equivalent to seizing hours from him and directing him to carry out various activities. That government taxation is in effect the government putting their hand in your pocket and taking out your hard-earned money, and it's all perfectly legal. It's legalised theft, whereas you are you should have absolute sovereignty over your talents and your earnings and do with it as you will. So Nozick, neoliberal thinker, and we looked at in the class notes how these thinkers ended up within conservatism. So the last conservative thinker then is Ayn Rand. Again, we mentioned Rand in conservatism. She was an emigre from Soviet Russia in her 20s, and clearly turned her into a radical advocate of free market capitalism, libertarianism. Her thought is really contained in novels rather than academic writings, and the two most well known are probably The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. And Paul Ryan, the Republican Speaker of the House for the first 2 years of the Trump administration, was a very big fan of Ayn Rand and said he tried to read Atlas Shrugged every year. And apparently he also gave it out as Christmas presents as well. So thanks, Paul, but I'm grand with the socks. But anyway, her thought was classified as something called objectivism. Objectivism, the first element of that was that only knowledge comes from reason and logic. She's a complete rationalist. But secondly, that the prime moral purpose of a life is the individual pursuit of happiness. Therefore, the best way for an individual pursuit of happiness is through a political and economic system consistent with individual and laissez-faire capitalism. This is kind of a restatement of extreme classical liberal thought. We are self-interested, self-reliant individuals. This Macpherson's idea of possessive individualism, and free market capitalism is the kind of system that will allow that to flourish, along with this idea of a minimal state. Because we're rational, self-interested, argue, we have a duty to be selfish. And if you look at that clip from Wall Street, Michael Douglas, where he makes kind of the greed is good speech, which is just a nice way that Oliver Stone, who kind of takes Rand and turns it into this nice kind of popular thing. We have a duty to be selfish. Greed is good. I suppose it also looks into, the Adam Smith, the quote from Adam Smith about it's not the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard for their own self-interest. It's individual self-interest, if you want to substitute the word greed, that drives forward progress. It always has done. People do things because they get something back from it. It's not from their own benevolence that the butcher and the baker and the candlestick maker produce goods for us. It's because they're going to profit from it. Of course, the socialists would say they do it from their own benevolence of their own heart because they're all fraternal, etc. But classical liberals say no, greed is good. And Ryan says we have a duty to be selfish. So looking at Rand's contribution, she sits there alongside Nozick. We are perfect human perfection. It's a classical liberal view. We're rational self-interest. We have a duty to be selfish, to act out of self-interest. State, minimal type of state. Economy, free market capitalism is the epitome of objectivism. And society, like for Nozick, is atomistic. It's not interdependent. It's completely atomistic. Forget your organic society and interconnectedness. We are all self-interested actors in society. And freedom, obviously negative freedom, aligned with a pure laissez-faire economy. So for Rand, freedom, forget positive freedom, is to ask nothing, to expect nothing, to depend on nothing. And throughout the centuries, there were men who took first steps down new roads armed with nothing but their own vision. And this kind of idea of the rugged, possessive individualism, and typical of the type of characters that she writes in The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged. So Nozick and Rand are key proponents in the syllabus of neoliberalism, although as mentioned before, you can use them in your liberalism essays, but not as key thinkers. You'd have to use them in conservative. You can drop in Hobbes if you want to find a place from in liberalism, but really only in passing. There's a nice spread of conservative thinkers there in terms of the tensions within them, obviously the tensions within the New Right, the tension between traditional and one nation, and between one nation and then the neoliberals as well. And Disraeli is always worth a mention in conservatism as well. Okay.